While they're getting settled in, I'll note that, as you've no doubt noticed, the layout of the room makes it conspicuous if you enter or exit. Don't hesitate, even when sessions are going on, if you need to leave the room for something to come in and out. We need to all just get comfortable with the ability to go in and out, even though the doors are right there and there. So don't hesitate. All right, so our first session. First, a word about our format for the event. Although we are set up in the conventional table with the cloth on it and the row of microphones and nameplates, and you can expect when you see that usually at a conference that you'll then be bombarded with a sequence of set piece presentations, and then the floor is open for questions. We were striving for something a little bit different with this event across all our sessions. We want them to be moderated dialogue. So in each case, we have a session moderator who's been in communication with the other participants in advance about various topics and questions that ought to be discussed. And it will hopefully be much more of a conversational, participatory, dialogue-style engagement, which is not to say that it won't eventually be opened up for questions from the floor. Of course, we will do that. But just so you're not surprised, it won't be a series of 15 minutes for each speaker moving along down the line. My job in each case will be to introduce the moderator, and it's a special pleasure for me to introduce this session's moderator, my good friend, colleague, and frequent co-author, Ben Wittes. Ben is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is co-founder, editor-in-chief, and the driving spirit within the Lawfare blog, which, as you may know, is a blog I also participate in. Lawfare is it's meant to be a place to go online to see coverage of the intersection between law and national security, very broadly understood, and it wouldn't exist without Ben. It wouldn't have the success it's had without Ben, and I'm grateful to be part of it and thank him for helping to us, for really making it happen. Somehow he finds time when not doing his duties at Brookings and not managing the blog and writing a tremendous stream of content for the blog to write a series of incredible books. And some of the books he's written that I'm most keen on include Detention and Denial, Law and the Long War, and the volume that he and our friend Ken Anderson are currently developing, Speaking the Law, which is a fascinating, almost real-time, released chapter by chapter exploration of how the Obama administration has used speeches, both from the president himself and from leading lawyers in the administration, to express the administration's position on the contested issues of legal policy that engage us all so much. On top of all that, he's got a black belt, so that, I think, is probably enough to get this conversation started. Thank you, Ben, for being here, and I'll turn over the rest of it to you.
Thanks so much. That was the most absurdly generous introduction I've gotten in a long time, and so this is why I come to Texas.
We do tall tales.
So I'm actually, having just received this incredibly gracious introduction, I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing my co-panelists at the risk of it seeming churlish to accept such an introduction and then not to give one. We actually don't have a whole lot of time, and I want to use as much of it for the discussion as possible. So Siobhan's, Shane's, and Ellen's very ample bios are in your packets, I believe. Just very briefly, Siobhan is with the Wall Street Journal, Shane is with Foreign Policy, and Ellen is with the Washington Post. Normally, when I moderate a panel, I try to apply a principle that Jefferson said about government, that the government that governs least governs best. I've never known whether I quite buy that about government, but I certainly buy it about moderators in a panel. I'm actually also going to sort of not do that this time because I think this is an area where I've actually been something of a critic of the way the press has handled this story, and so I want to use this as an opportunity to be sort of a bit of the Grand Inquisitor. I want to start, however, by asking the panelists, just to talk a little bit about what it's like, been covering this story over the last, it's almost a year now, 10 months. And it has been, I think for probably all of them, pretty all-consuming. It's a weird agency to try to cover as a reporter. Just start, Siobhan, and go down. What are your like thoughts on the project at this stage of its development?
Well, you asked to describe the process. I think it's been fairly grinding since June, whatever it was, 5th. I think the evening of June 5th, when I was making dinner, it was probably 8 o'clock at night, just got the kid to bed. An email comes in on my phone forwarding a link from The Guardian, an editor saying, the editors in New York are really freaking out about this. Don't we know this already? And it's the phone data program, right? And I was sort of preoccupied with things. I look at the headline, I read the first few paragraphs, I'm like, we know this. This is circa 2006. USA Today did a very ample story at that point. This isn't news. And then he gets back to me and says, the editors in New York are really freaking out about this. And I said, okay. So I open the thing and I scroll through and I'm kind of like, okay. And then all of a sudden I look at, it was either the top or the bottom of the story, and there's a link to a FISA court, opinion. I said, well, this is different. These are not the kinds of things you normally read. So, I sort of say, okay, we've got a story here. And I kind of, get through the rest of the evening and kind of grudgingly write up this story, feeling like, hey, we already knew this, but there is a document here, so we need to go ahead and do the story. And off we were with what would become sort of the series of leaks from Edward Snowden. And it's been really interesting to me because having covered these issues over a fair amount of time now, almost 10 years, this time it really is different, and I've spent some time kind of trying to figure out why. And I think that at the center of it is because it's involved the leak of actual documents. And so, whereas before, when we would report on a surveillance activity, or really, almost any intelligence activity, reporters would do their best to get as much of the story as possible, and you'd be lucky to get between 1% and 10% of the story. And you'd have a back and forth with officials in government once you felt like you had the story together. And after you vet to the degree that you can and have whatever exchanges you're going to have, you go forth with the story. And that is how it's been done. It's pretty rare to actually get documents, certainly not ones that have top secret stripped across the top, unless they've been subsequently declassified. So, what's been transformative about this is that there is so much evidence that it has prompted an entirely different response from the government than what normally happened. And what we have seen over time, and it was pretty slow at the beginning, but what we've seen over time is increasing acknowledgement on the part of government officials of certain kinds of activities that are going on. Is it to the degree that would, really satisfy me and make me feel like, we have the most comprehensive story that we possibly could on any given program? No, but it has really, really changed sort of the nature of both the way reporters are interacting with the government, as well as sort of the degree to which journalists can actually tell a complete story. And I think that it's just been sort of an interesting shift in the way that the reporting process has really gone along. We can kind of discuss that more as we go down, but at the risk of droning on, I'll pass it over.
I had a similar experience to Siobhan in that I was coming home on the night of June 5th, and I got an email from my literary agent. Back in 2010, I'd published a book called The Watchers, which was sort of describing this world, but through the point of view of people who'd been in government and again, not relying at all on documents. An email was a link to the Guardian story, and he just had the subject line, "Whoa." And a very similar reaction. You read it at first, and you're saying, wait a second, call records, we get this. And then you see that there's this FISA court document attached to it, which, just kind of to repeat the significance of that, that has never happened. I mean, and your immediate reaction is, oh my God, somebody leaked from inside the FISA court, what's going on? And so that set off this whole rather extraordinary set of reactions and responses. And it was very clear within the first 12 hours that, that the attention on this was really significant and was going to keep building. And of course, more stories just kind of kept coming and coming and coming. My life reporting that story for the first 3 months or so largely consisted of waking up in the morning, going to work, waiting to see what Ellen's paper or The Guardian would be publishing that day, and then sort of counting down the seconds until my editor came to my desk and said, what do we do? What do we do? How do we follow it? So there was this initial kind of just flood of information that was really extraordinary. And it was a grinding process to try and cover it and to try to make sense of it. Where I tried to come at it was not having access to those documents, trying to sort of call upon all the years that I'd done reporting on NSA and on surveillance and trying to find other stories that we could add to it that obviously were not going to be based on source material. But I think suffice to say, it's been, for me as a journalist, having covered this topic for the better part of a decade now, it's been the most extraordinary period in my professional life. It's relentless, it's grinding, there is so much information, it is so complicated, it is so highly technical and legal, and you just sometimes kind of pinch yourself because you can't believe it's all being made public. I mean, it's quite a thing to be covering, and not one that I ever expected. It was funny, when we published my book in 2010, there was a sense of, well, this is kind of old news, and it's a retrospective history of the rise of surveillance, and then this happens, and suddenly everything old is new again. To kind of go on one thing that Siobhan said about why this story has taken off the way it has, absolutely, the documents are the central sort of part of that. I also think that two other things that go along with it. One really is the way that this story has been discussed and poured over in social media. The ability for experts and advocates and journalists and all kinds of people to, in close to real time, dissect the meaning of these documents, the import of the documents, to challenge each other's thinking on it. That we didn't have that just a few years ago. And the other, of course, is that the central figure in this is the ultimate source, identified himself very publicly and has now taken a role in the discourse of himself, of course, Edward Snowden. That's unique, I think, in these kinds of stories. And I do think that if you did not have him as a human face and kind of a protagonist in the narrative, I don't think the story would have gotten as much traction and as many legs, as we say in our business. And I think there's a possibility that it may have been starting to die down now. And you're starting to feel it kind of taper off, and we can talk more about that. But just the presence of Edward Snowden also made this a unique story.
So I think this June 5th, 215 order is becoming another one of these, where were you when JFK was shot moments for national security journalists. But because I certainly also distinctly remember being outside on the patio, having prepared it's going to be a wonderful early summer dinner, like 6:15, and I was just sitting down to have my glass of Sauvignon Blanc, and I happened to foolishly check my BlackBerry, and I saw this email from a privacy advocate saying, "Have you seen this story in The Guardian?" I clicked on it, and I also quickly clicked on what looked like to be a document. I saw the court order. I ran upstairs, and I started calling sort of sources and said, "Is this what it looks to be?" And check the name of the judge. It all seemed to check out, and I said, "Oh my God, I think this is a big story." And immediately also felt like it was a story that would have legs, because if this really was the sort of documentation of this telephone metadata program, which we had heard about, this was the first sort of official kind of confirmation of it. The government couldn't just deny it or ignore it, as sort of happened back in 2006 when there was a little bit of an issue with one of the facts in the story, and I think the U.S. Today walked it back a little bit and the story died. In this case, the government fairly quickly declassified the existence of the program, acknowledged it. What was also a little interesting or different for me was that I guess it was maybe the next day, and as we're thinking, okay, this is the big story, I hear that a colleague of mine at the Post actually had other documents and was going to be coming out with a big story. In fact, I think it was maybe that night or the next night, and that was Bart Gellman, who was breaking the PRISM story. And I'm all of a sudden starting to realize that, wait a minute, this is not just a one-off. It's not just this one document. You know, maybe there are other documents and other stories. And it just became a whirlwind week and then month of disclosures and trying being whipsawed back and forth between what the Guardian has and what maybe my colleague Bart has. At this point, I think in full disclosure, I should also say that Bart is the person at the Post who has received the documents from Edward Snowden, and sort of, you know, remains the sort of sole gatekeeper for the documents at the Post. I have collaborated with Bart on one or two stories, but for the most part, he retains sort of control over the documents, and you know, doesn't really even tell, I think, all the editors how many he has or what all's in them, largely for security purposes. So I would say like the first 3, 4, 5, 6 months even were yes, sort of focused on the documents and on what the government was also disclosing in reaction to the leaks, which, you know, is an important point to mention, which is this sort of transparency by the government was forced by the leaks, the media leaks. Sort of was the forcing function for this transparency on the part of the government. And we were kind of consumed by, you know, reporting on these court orders from the FISA court, making sense of them, putting them into context. But now, I think a year on, it's a good time to sort of step back and take stock at not only what a dynamic and really unprecedentedly rich and broad debate this has been, but also the fact that we're starting to also put this in context and understand some deeper fundamental issues about this, what I see as a monumental shift in our approach to surveillance post 9/11, bred of, you know, advances in technology and the need to try to prevent another 9/11. And we can talk about this a little more, but I see this as sort of the core issue of you know, journalistic inquiry here, which is this shift to broad collection at the front end without the sort of traditional individualized warrants or other limits, to having the privacy protections put on at the back end, you know, through minimization and restrictions on use and sharing. And those have implications for U.S. privacy, and as we're seeing now also, you know, privacy of non-U.S. persons. And I think, you know, those are the sorts of issues that we are really having to grapple with as reporters, and to try to convey them to the larger public. Okay?
So I want to focus a little bit on your all's evaluation of the press's institutional performance here. So usually when you get a group of reporters together, there's a certain triumphalism about the press, and I've been part of the press and therefore been part of that triumphalism myself. In this case, you have a somewhat different dynamic, which is that a lot of people have I'm one of them, have criticized aspects of the press's performance institutionally in this space. And specifically in, I think broadly speaking, in 3 areas. The first is that media organizations have published things that shouldn't be published. And the second is that some of the stories that have been published have been inaccurate in either big ways or small ways. And the third is that there is a wash of information relative to context, such that you kind of increase the amount of information, but not increase the amount of wisdom. And I'm interested in talking about all 3 of those areas. Shane, let's start with you. What in that broad indictment is fair and what's unfair?
I will say at the outset, I think that in general, I think the press has acquitted itself very well. And I think that we have done a good job of covering the story, certainly comprehensively, and trying to capture all of the data that comes out in all of these various leaks in the various forms that come out, mostly in documents. Where I think that institutionally speaking, I think we have not done a great job and I can include myself in this as well, probably goes to your third critique. I think that in many cases our stories have, by necessity, delved into the weeds of the technology and of the policy, because it is fundamentally important to understand each of these programs and these activities on their own. And where I think we've not done a great job is sort of stepping back and frankly, for your ordinary reader, explaining, like, what does any of this actually mean? Like, what do I need to pay the most attention to? What's important? What is less important? And making more critical evaluations of it to try and explain to them, listen, this is how the narrative all fits together. It's extremely difficult to do from a tradecraft perspective when every day or so or every week is bringing a new revelation, and we have to give that the attention that it's owed and that it's due. I'm not saying that hasn't been done, but I think we could be doing a better job of trying to contextualize it and sort of add the knowledge or the wisdom to the data that we're collecting.
And you're comfortable with the proposition that the average member of the public, controlling for that, reading the string of stories that appeared, including the ones that contain substantial errors, has come away in the aggregate better informed and has gotten a reasonable account of where the initial stories were less than entirely fulsome or accurate?
I doubt it. I don't know that most people who I know. I mean, I use my own family as a barometer of this. Don't know whether the government's listening to their phone calls or reading all of their emails. There is substantial confusion around this for a lot of people. I think that prior to these stories, though, they assumed that it was happening. I mean, for a lot of people who read these stories, I think that it does not come as a surprise or a shock, and they're not that outraged by it, frankly. So I don't know that we have done a great job of sort of just stepping back and saying, here are the 10 things that you need to know. I mean, I had a conversation about this about a month ago with a former editor of a very prominent magazine who said, look, I'm a sophisticated person, I'm a journalist, and I don't know what to make of this. And I wish there were more stories out there just saying, look, here's what you need to know, here's what you should be paying attention to, and trying to contextualize it. And that's our job. I mean, that is really the role. That is the role that we play in this entire equation. And we haven't done it perfectly. I think we've been much more focused, again, I think by necessity of the volume of information, on diving down into the nuances of each of those programs that come out, which, by the way, we have to do too. I mean, you have to do both. You can't just do one or the other.
Could I just?
Ellen, what do you think?
Well,
how do you assess it?
In fact, this goes exactly to the point I was trying to make about how, now almost a year into this, it's time to really sort of do the step back and put it all in context and look at really sort of the fundamental issues at stake, which I think have also tended to get lost in over the last year or so in some of the some of this coverage, some of the debate has gotten a little too acrimonious, in my opinion, and gotten caught up in whether Edward Snowden is a traitor or a hero, which I think distracts from sort of the fundamental issues. And as I was sort of saying, I think, Admiral Inman was saying, American people still ask him, is the NSA spying on us? Well, if the question is the NSA spying on you for political purposes, the answer is no. But the NSA has been, at the direction of the administration, of the government, been collecting large amounts of information, in some cases metadata, in some cases content, and for the purposes of counterterrorism and for purposes of foreign intelligence. And in some cases, now in the case of 215, that includes Americans' phone numbers, right? Their numbers, what time their calls were, and how long. There's debate, legitimate debate, about whether or not that constitutes a sort of invasion of privacy. Does that cross the line in some way? There's also debate about whether it's legal, whether it's constitutional, but putting aside the legality and the constitutionality, is it the right thing to do? Is it the wise thing to do? Do we want to do it? President Obama recently just came out and said, even though I believe it's legal and it has value, because of the potential for abuse, I think that kind of collection by the government has to stop. So those are sort of, some of the deeper underlying first principles types of questions we need to really focus on. And at the same time, I think what we're seeing, what's emerging is this really interesting other issue of overseas collection. And because of the changing nature of technology and the fact that your and my emails and texts can be zipping around the world and be stored in data centers, US data centers, companies' data centers overseas, and zipping back and forth, those can get collected in massive amounts before. Are the back-end privacy protections right now adequate, sufficient to protecting Americans' privacy? These are a little more nuanced questions than whether or not, J. Edgar Hoover has ordered spying on Martin Luther King, all right, or political protesters. But these are nonetheless, I think, important questions. And briefly, we're as the press we're kind of not, just a handful of establishment papers and newspapers anymore and magazines. The institution of the press has greatly broadened to include bloggers. Lawfare is part of the press in a sense, who's covering this debate and helping to inform it. And I would agree with Shane that in general, I think, especially in the establishment press, we've acquitted ourselves well or tried to stick to the issues, but we're not perfect. I know mistakes are made. We should try to avoid them. We should correct them. In the case of there was a story last summer about the NSA collecting 70 million French communications that broke. I'm not sure if it was in a European paper or what. Siobhan and I, though, both also did stories, I think, fairly close the next day, front page, in our case, saying, no, this was, not true, that, in fact, it was the French government collecting this and sharing it with the U.S. So that, that's one example where we try to be as accurate as possible.
You stole my example. A couple thoughts. Just one on the question of, how has the institution of the press performed? I think that I sort of question that assumption of whether there is an institution of the press anymore. I think that this story, perhaps more than many, has shown how much the institution, so to speak, has fragmented. I mean, we have historically kind of come at these kinds of stories from the perspective of the U.S. press. And so, you look at questions of, has U.S. law been broken? And you could have, some sort of engagement back and forth with the interested parties in government as to whether or not this is a legitimate story, whether it harms national security, things like that. This time around, it's an international story, and it's largely driven by individuals. I mean, Edward Snowden gave documents to individuals. Those individuals have now affiliated themselves with many, many publications over time. I mean, it's been kind of strange to see the same names now appearing in so many different publications. That's not how it's happened. I mean, this is a set of documents that has literally spawned its own publication. I mean, all of these things are very unusual, and I think it means that the sort of traditional ways in which these stories were reported, the kind of thing that Admiral Inman talked about, sort of his establishing this formal back and forth with the news media. I mean, that is actually roughly up until a year or so ago how it worked. I mean, you got a story, you got a sensitive story, you put the pieces together, you brought it to, you go through the front door to the press office, and then you'd have a back and forth. It might be a brief one, it might be an extended one, but the idea was that once you went to press with a story, you at least had some understanding of the implications of that, and the government had an understanding of how they were going to handle it too. That can't happen with sort of the current arrangement because there are just so many different actors. And I think that means that at one level you have a lot of intense competition, which in our industry is usually very good. But at another level, because that competition is so intense and because the metabolism now of the media is so much higher, probably than it was even a year or two ago, you end up probably with more errors perpetuating themselves. I remember when we learned that the the reports about the collection of data in France and Spain were incorrect. I mean, it took me a while to kind of wrap my head around that because, it was like, well, but we saw the documents. And, in talking to various sources, we came to understand, well, just as with, complicated documents, things aren't always immediately what they seem. And we, made the effort to report that out, and it went on the front page of the paper. But, interestingly, that those concerns have been perpetuated, and it may well be because there are additional reports out there that have perpetuated this sense of NSA, collecting tons and tons of data from, allied countries and things like that. But the government's response has also been to try to address it. I mean, one of the key things that President Obama has proposed is providing greater protections to citizens abroad. And I still haven't really been able to figure out what specifically that's responding to, because it can't be responding to the issue about spying on foreign leaders, because that they're dealing with that through other mechanisms. So sometimes the government's response has also seemed to, I think, perpetuate at least what some in government feel to be misconceptions. So that, I think, has contributed at least to, some additional confusion sometimes. And then on the last issue, just having to do with providing context. I mean, I think it can be very hard just because of the volumes of documents going on to provide context for each one of them. One thing that the journal has done, and we're certainly not unique in this, and Shane and Ellen have certainly done this too, but our approach sort of generally has been, we actually aren't really reporting document by document on the Snowden materials. What we're doing instead is just using it as an opportunity to report more broadly on what's going on in the surveillance arena. So whether that's other programs, tapping the internet backbone, other 215 programs, things like that, or trying to just kind of track the government response and sort of look at what the follow-on impacts are. There are media outlets that are trying to, fill in blanks and provide context as well, but that can just be very hard with a deluge of documents for everybody to kind of really feel like they have a comprehensive picture.
So as people have questions, just signal me, and I will brutally interrupt our panelists to give you a chance to pose them. I'm interested in Siobhan's point that this episode is heavily conditioned by the decision of Edward Snowden to give the documents to individuals, which is a point that I've made as well, and that I think colors an enormous amount of what has happened since. And all three of the recipients, with the exception, I suppose, of Glenn Greenwald, who was affiliated with The Guardian at the time he received the material and is no longer, took the documents with him, basically. You basically have a major leak of a giant trove of information to individuals who then have the media organizations kind of over a barrel in terms of their negotiations with them. And I'm interested for all of your sense of how that affects the dynamics. How would this have been different if the trove of documents had gone to you in your capacity as a Wall Street Journal reporter? Or
The stories would have been fabulous.
They would have all been fabulous.
And all had tons of context.
And it'll be out there now.
And particularly,
All 6 million of
it's
them.
actually a particularly interesting question to Ellen. So they go to the Washington Post, but they go to you in your employed capacity as the Washington Post, rather than to Bart, who then brings them to the Post and controls access to them, as you described before. How is the world different if that's the way things played a year ago?
Yeah, I don't know unless, I haven't seen the documents, but I guess generally speaking, I think in many ways we would have had to do some of the same things, which is find a secure way to keep the documents. I don't know a lot of detail about that. This has been one of the most highly compartmentalized reporting endeavors ever seen at the Washington Post. I will say that. And I can't say very much more, beyond sort of describing in broad terms what our the Post's general policy is in terms of dealing with the government in vetting, documents and what stories we're going to publish and whether there's weighing the national security damage against the public policy risk. But I don't feel comfortable speculating really about how it might be different.
Siobhan?
Well, I mean, just a couple thoughts. One, if they were given to one U.S. news institution, I'll just be agnostic on who that would be. It changes. I think it changes the conversation a little bit with the government in a couple ways. One, it ends up just being, I think it would end up falling in the traditional model of you have information, you piece it together, you do some additional reporting, you think you have the story and you understand it, you go through the press office at the relevant agency, and then you have a back and forth about a story. In this case, what you've seen is a proliferation of documents, often to international press, which they could have a conversation with the U.S. government, but they're making a different calculation. They're not making calculations based on U.S. national security. If you're Der Spiegel, what you care about is who's spying on you. And so the nature of what makes a story changes quite a bit. I also think that if one story, or if one media organization, say a U.S. media organization, has sort of a monopoly over this huge trove of documents, that changes the competitive pressures as well. So you probably would actually see stories coming out more slowly because reporters would feel like, well, we have time to do some additional reporting here, and we don't have to get it all out there. But not being a part of the group of journalists that has them, I can only imagine that there is a lot of concern about, well, if people have roughly similar sets of documents, you want to make sure you find the best ones first and put it out there. And so you may not always have time to do as much reporting on a given document or story as you might want to do under that circumstance.
I want to amplify on that too, because I have some thoughts on this. I mean, first, I want to say that it may be unique in journalism to have a situation where a source gave over so much material that is so highly specific to a group of people and then essentially no longer became the custodian of those records and then transferred that sort of role onto the reporters. There's maybe an analogy with WikiLeaks, but I think there's some important differences there which we don't have to go into right now. But this may be a unique situation where the reporters are sort of the custodian of the record and also the reporting on it. And that creates all kinds of challenges that I think we are still working through. Mm-hmm. But it is absolutely the case that then led to the proliferation of these different news organizations. I think that one of the knock-on effects of that has been that the threshold for what makes it into a newspaper or a news organization based on how sensitive is it, should we report on it, does it reveal too much about sources and methods, that threshold has dropped. And I think that I am convinced that there are stories that are running after June 2013 that would not have run before June 2013 because of the competitive pressures in our business.
Can you name one?
Several. I think the sources, stories that have named individual targets, whether they be companies or countries for surveillance, stories that have published technical diagrams and specifics on how exploits are put out. I'm not saying that they should or shouldn't have been published. I'm not taking a view on that. I want to be very clear. But I think there would have been much more resistance to publishing some of these highly technical stories before June of 2013. And one of the reasons why I think you're seeing more of them is because the general presumption is they're going to get out one way or another, and we might as well go ahead and do it our way.
Could I also, but just push back a little bit on that, with the caveat that I have not been involved in many of these actual stories, so don't know the full, what went into the reporting. However, I do know that, because I know Bart and Ashkan Sultani, who we've hired on as sort of a technical expert to contribute as well to the story, because we felt it was important to really try to understand, as best we could, what it is that we were seeing in the documents. But I do think in every case, when they ran a story, they believed it was because it was important for the public to know. And I do know that between BART and the government, and sometimes the editors and the ODNI usually and NSA, there were conversations and discussions about whether certain points, details, documents would be damaging, and beyond loss of life issues, would they blow operations? Because in general, I think the idea was to enable debate and discussion and not shut down the program or foreclose discussion because the program could no longer be conducted. And just one recent example, I think, is it's this program Mystic that Bart and Ashkan wrote about, which reportedly collects all phone call content in a country. The country was known to them. I don't know what country it is, but they withheld the country's name because they were persuaded in discussions with the government that to reveal the country would blow the operation, would be damaging.
So we have several questions from the floor, which I'm going to, I guess I'm going to ask that we take them in order, and then the order that I saw them, and why don't we just line them up, and then the panel can address whichever ones seem most relevant to them. So we have Bruce Schneider, Chris Inglis, and Admiral Inman. Why don't we just go in order and line up a bunch of questions, and then we'll talk.
I mean, one of the interesting things about these documents and these stories is there are actually several stories. I mean, you're talking about how the tech is good and the politics and social is bad. My response is the exact opposite. The tech is terrible and much worse than the politics. And the stories are being written for different audience. As a technologist, I need the tech details to try to fix these things, try to improve security. And I think one of the issues we have is that the stories are being written by mainstream newspapers, mainstream journalists for a mainstream audience. And the technology details we need, I mean, the stuff that I look to when I'm writing about these documents is the more the technology. And I think that dynamic is very interesting because the tech is extraordinarily complicated, and when they get it wrong, they're getting the tech wrong and extrapolating into policy. And it's just, and I agree, though, when they get it wrong, it's kind of a disaster. But it's because these are very technically hard, and there's not, while there are good tech people looking at it, there often isn't the outlet for those tech stories that Ash and I want to write, for example.
Well, I mean, that is precisely why we hired Ashkan Sultani. But then there's sort of, it has to be this process of translating as well the insights that Ashkan brings to a general audience, to our audience. And that's not easy.
Do you want us to respond to each question as we go?
Let's play it by ear. Okay. I would just, one further response, there's an exact analog point on the law to the point that you just made on the tech. The law is also extraordinarily dense and complicated, and you get a PowerPoint presentation that summarizes a program, and it has these kind of high altitude statements about law, and the translation of that in the coverage into what the FISA requires in that situation can be a very tricky little problem.
So we're all annoyed at the aspect of the coverage we know best.
Exactly.
Well, I also think that one point that you're also speaking to is just the limitations of reporting based on documents. There's certainly an allure there that once you have the documents, you know exactly what's going on. As with the aforementioned example with the boundless informant slides on France and Spain, sometimes there's actually a lot of interpretive work that goes into that, and I'm not sure that there's really any reporter out there with the resources to really be able to understand, taking a look at each individual slide to know exactly what that means, which is, I think, why we've engaged far more with NSA on this story than we have on any other story. Because when it comes down to it, this is the agency where the documents came from. They're going to know generally what they mean, and that's why we're kind of seeing a constant testing of how much NSA is willing to say to explain and correct inaccuracies as they see them floating around. So, one good thing about having the documents is they're now available for technology specialists to look at and also try to make sense of. But the difficulty there is, documents in and of themselves obviously aren't going to have the context you need to understand.
So my question begins where Bruce left off. I agree that it is a disaster when these stories are mistold, whether it's through the technology lens, the law lens, or the policy lens, and then we spend the rest of our time trying to chase that with a fuller telling of the story. I think I respect and appreciate that the day after, right, the story was mistold about what NSA may or may not have done in France or Germany or Norway. There's a front page article that essentially tried to tell the rest of that story. But it's like the old adage in business, which is it's generally first to market, not best to market, that wins, right? And everybody else is in a tail chase. So my hope is that the answer to the question that was asked was that if this had been given to the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, other kind of mainstream media outlets, that your answer in terms of what would you have done was to try to tell the fuller telling of the story. That upon recognizing you had a leak of something called a secondary order on June 5th, you would have said maybe there's a primary order. Maybe the rest of the story is important to tell this in context so that we don't so much titillate and inflame, but we inform. That's my hope. And now looking over our shoulder and saying that that's an opportunity cost of how we spent much of 2013, that we might have this moment in time to say we're going to stop, pause, right, and actually try to be more deliberate and more kind of thoughtful. And I don't mean by that to criticize that we've been unthoughtful, but to be more full in the telling of the story. And the risk you'll run is that you'll sometimes be second to market, but that we hopefully can overwhelm, right, those who are in the fast lane with their titillating stories, with what might be more appealing to the audience that we're trying to actually tell the story to, as they say, I've been titillated, I've kind of gone to the edge, I think I now understand the worst possibilities here. I'd like to have a deeper understanding of this. I want to buy the book, not the newspaper on this.
Can I just make a comment on that too? I think we're about there. I mean, I can just sort of feel that within the newsroom, that the appetite, especially among my editors, for yet another story about X, Y, Z it's really diminished. And I think that's where we come in with my earlier critique, that we haven't been adding that context. I mean, I decided to go write a book, which will be out in November, by the way. And so, and I hope that that's where we're going next, because I mean, we've been sort of operating at a rather breakneck speed for the past 10 months, and it might be time to just come up for air and take a breath. But I think institutionally that is happening.
I think it'll go one of two ways, because certainly in the last few months, the story, just sort of based on each document, it's been kind of diminishing returns, because I think people's sort of sense of the narrative, so to speak, gets said, and now each document doesn't add necessarily that much more to that. And so I think what it will be is kind of maybe a combination of three things. One, I mean, there's obviously a lot of focus on what the response is, how the government is responding, what changes, what doesn't change, and that will certainly be a story that continues. I do think that there will be some demand, I hope, for kind of broader step back pieces. Let's reassess, let's figure out how it is that we really got here. So that we can understand, where these issues now take us. Technology isn't going to stop changing. Surveillance isn't going to end. Countries still need to know what kind of national security threats lurk out there, and obviously surveillance is a key way for any government to understand that. So these issues aren't going away. One thing I do wonder, and I think we'll see what happens, is if we do start seeing a drop-off in sort of the rolling out of documents, whether or not the public interest just sort of evaporates. And that's sort of, as someone who has followed these issues for a long time and cares a lot about them, I truly hope that doesn't happen. But the media is sort of there's a supply and demand relationship you have with your audience. And so, if people, it turns out, are no longer interested in surveillance, just want to know what the local, sports news is, then all of a sudden it becomes harder to get those stories in the paper. And so, what I think we're all probably working for is to make sure that we can pull some of those broader stories together soon enough so that you kind of keep riding that wave before it just sort of.
Could I take a follow-up? And I'll just say that this might surprise you, and I'm no longer in the government, but I kind of speak as if I were. My hope is that we don't let that happen, right? That we don't let this kind of go into some cul-de-sac and some quiet backwater, because we'll need the calculus of understanding, we'll need that context of understanding the next time this spikes, the next time somebody tells a salacious kind of rendition of the story that we didn't have as a basis of larger understanding in June of 2013. And so the time to actually kind of set the stage for whatever this turns into in the next kind of, rendering of this story is now. And so we need to keep pushing this before the public so that it becomes something that I think I understand that in context, I'm comfortable with that. And anything that departs from that in an extraordinary salacious way, they can place into context because they have the foundation in hand.
Can I just say, I actually think the document drop-off happened a while ago, and I think that the big revelations were the 215 program, to some extent PRISM, and then maybe starting in the fall, we started to see a wave of stories about overseas collection under 12333, which is more of a sleeper story, but I think it's one worth paying attention to, because as we start to understand a little bit better the cause for the shift and what the implications are for this sort of, we don't even really understand as public yet what the scale of this kind of collection is, and what the scale of incidental collection is of used person data under this type of collection. But I do think that's an important policy question about whether or not the minimization, the privacy protections that are afforded to these communications are adequate. I think that the story has shifted. We're almost a year into this now. It's shifted. It started to shift a while ago, but it's clearly shifted now, right, to Congress especially. For a while there, I would say December, January, the focus was on the White House, on Obama. What was he going to do? There was the White House Review Board report, then there was the PCLOB report, and then what was Obama going to do? And he made his decision. I think that, too, is an important thing to note, is the political climate has shifted dramatically from about a year ago. It looked like, and when the initial revelations came out, about the 215 telephone program, metadata program, that, okay, this was going to cause maybe some stir, controversy, fulfillment, debate, but probably wasn't going to change, right? And then the Amash vote, amendment vote aside in July, then you start to just see, however, because of the reporting that we all have done, and the richness of the debate, that in the end, Obama decided that this sort of bulk collection should no longer continue. And I think an important question that we should pursue as journalists in the coming year is whether or not that ban on so-called bulk collection of telephone metadata should apply more broadly to all forms of bulk collection and be put in statute. I think that's an important policy question. It's still an open one. And then a second question is whether this newfound transparency is really a permanent shift, is it going to be baked into the culture of the agencies, or is it more of a sort of a tactical move, to try to respond to the crisis of the moment, and one that will subside as the document releases subside?
Admiral?
I'm clearly a generation earlier than all of this, but you will have gotten earlier my concern at introducing judicial review and congressional oversight. There's a tendency to overclassify. I've watched that my whole life. From your perspective now, looking at all that you've seen, would you propose dealing differently with the FISA court's decisions reporting, what's not. I remain unreconstructed. You have to protect who the targets are and something that might tell them their vulnerability you're exploiting. But from what you've watched, would it have been helpful? Could we take a better view now of what's said about the judicial review and how that process goes down, and the oversight from the committee?
Are you saying should more have been known about what the FISA court was doing?
Yes.
I think the answer is certainly yes, particularly once the role of the FISA court was shifted so profoundly in 2008. Once you shift to something kind of now known as a programmatic warrant, you're not talking about specific sources. You are talking about methods in a very broad way, but it's a program. It's not individuals. It's not tapping an individual source's phone. And in most cases, you don't even know. I mean, you could do it without talking about specific companies or something like that, I suppose. But I think that we've even seen a certain number of intelligence leaders at this point saying that they should have been more upfront earlier on about the nature of some of these programs, because it would have reduced kind of the public shock once all of these disclosures happened. And I think that particularly once you have a court that is responsible for approving and also overseeing whole programs, it's important, certainly for the public, to appreciate that that's what's going on. And as someone who was covering this in 2008, at the time, I don't think I know that I didn't fully understand what was meant by what they were calling a basket warrant. The way the folks on the Hill were describing it when they passed that law was, well, now we can go after specific groups of individuals. So it seemed like you could have a basket warrant for Al-Qaeda and a basket warrant for Hezbollah. It wasn't described to us in a way that was, well, you can have a basket warrant for tapping, different parts of the internet backbone, and you can have a basket warrant for, bulk collection, or, I mean, that's a separate program. I'll keep away from that. But a basket warrant for the prison program, and that you could have entire, structures of programs that just got one warrant, and that was how it was working. And so I think that if the public had better understood what the implications of those changes were in 2008, and ideally where they came from, because all these programs, most of them had predecessors, I think that there just would have been a fuller understanding of how NSA was using these authorities. And, it also would have given the government an opportunity to explain the levels of controls that were going on in terms of the role of the courts.
So I think we have time for one more question from the audience, and then we will, I'll give each of the panelists a chance to wrap up.
After a year of revelation of these documents, has the industry or anyone noticed a pattern of how they were released? There's been a focus on privacy. There's been a focus on international relations, or how our allies will now relate to the United States, the war on terror, possibly public revolt. Has there been a pattern noticed on how they were released and the information that was released?
I thought that I knew one in the beginning, but I don't know that it holds up now. I mean, it certainly seemed like the two first stories were the most significant, so I presume that the journalists looked at what they had and said, what's the most important story, and let's get those out first. There seemed to be some that were timed to meetings that were going on with foreign leaders. I don't know whether that was calculated or not. I'm not sure I can really detect any rhyme or reason particularly on them now, except that I presume that journalists are working on some stories that take much longer to report and to research, and that's why some of them may come out later. I mean, Bruce may actually have some insights into that question, too.
Quickly, basically it's random. There's an enormous number of documents. Yes, you find the good stories come out first, but there's no master plan. I think a lot of the timing coincidences were basically coincidences, because there's just so much, and there's no way to read it all and say, here are my top stories, in order. You read, and then, oh, this is a good one, let's go with that.
But one hopes that, and I don't know this because I don't have access to the documents, that if there is a PowerPoint presentation describing surveillance of people for political purposes, that somebody has done a meta-cataloging of what's in the database, so that we're not 2 years from now finding out, wow, this is a story we should have had 3 years ago.
I would not be surprised if something like that happens. My God, we missed this.
I think that,
Hard to catalog.
yeah, I think it's.
What's
I'm sorry.
that?
I think there is a
I wouldn't be surprised that there's something, that explosive in the set that would indicate the government has in fact violated, right, the Constitution, the laws derived from that, and such.
That's not an answer. I'm saying that there probably is something in the set that's a really big story that's just been missed until now.
I think there's a little bit more of a pattern than any of you have said, which is that the stories start with the most explosive stuff relative to U.S. person privacy, the programmatic activity that is most surprising from a U.S. privacy point of view. It continues on U.S. person privacy-related stuff until that stuff seems to be more or less exhausted, at which point it moves on to foreign nationals' privacy in stuff that is indisputably lawful under U.S. law, but kind of rubs a lot of people the wrong way overseas for entirely understandable reasons. U.S. law favors U.S. persons' privacy. If you happen to be German, that's not the most comforting thing in the world. And then as that stuff has, under 702, has started to wane, it has kind of moved on to what to 12333 collection. I think it loosely tracks the declining controversy of the relevant legal authorities.
Was that industry-driven or Snowden-driven by the release of that?
So I have no insight whatsoever.
From what
into,
little I know, it's not Snowden-driven. I mean, it's really, from what little I know, I think up to the individual reporters who possess the documents to decide what to report on or to disclose or publish and when.
My own perspective, one perspective of many, is that this has not been independent of the people who Snowden released these documents to in the first place. They had their biases. Most of those biases presupposed, based upon the experience, the perspective that they enjoyed, that the government was acting in contravention to its own constitution, its own laws, and in contravention to the values and principles it shares with other governments. And so the picking and telling of the stories essentially feed or support that bias. That's my sense of what the stories have done. And even when those stories are picked, right, there's a little bit of cherry picking in terms of telling the story in the most salacious way, a focus on capabilities that might be abused as opposed to demonstrating that, in fact, that they have been abused.
Can I be a reporter real quick and just ask, do you agree with Ellen's assessment that Snowden is not directing or has any kind of say over what gets published and when?
I would say, honestly, I don't know, but my sense is he is no longer in control of this. He's largely dropped these, and then the choice of when and where to paste this is no longer in his control.
We are at the end of our hour. Thanks to the panel, and thanks to all who contributed from the floor.